Bullet point. The defendant making statements to Detective Senior Constable Gatwood, including that, open quote, breaking the rules could cost him his life, end quote, and the references to hanging, which are in effect threats of violence that are promoted by a person, group, or ideology that supports violent extremism, namely the UKOA. The police have a serious notion of threat from this UKOA. They have sought to attempt to bring it into a terrorism organisation that has ideologies and is violent extremists. They just paint anybody they don't like with a tarred brush. This is who they are. This is what they do. Bullet point. What was said in the email in July 2020 regarding, open quote, holding to account under military jurisdiction, end quote, any police officer that, open quote, tries to force themselves onto me, end quote, and, open quote, I'm sure I don't have to point out that war crimes may be punishable by death, and the Nuremberg trials will tell you that following orders will not protect you from a rope around your neck, end quote, amongst other statements. Bullet point. The YouTube video on 27 July 2020 that included comments implying that certain police activity was treason, that the police are, open quote, a foreign military threatening peaceful civilians, end quote, and that police should be exposed to the punishment of hanging. 53. It was submitted that the fact that the threats appeared to contemplate some form of court or tribunal proceedings, first occurring before the punishment of hanging, does not deprive from the propositions expressed of their extremist character. This is where you ask Matthew Reason if he'd like a bucket of feathers as well, because that's all he's doing. He's attempting to tar someone with a label that he and the state can then further label the label. 54. In terms of assessing whether there was an unacceptable risk of committing a serious terrorism offence, the plaintiff emphasised the facts giving rise to the Commonwealth offences which stemmed from the defendant's ideological connection with the UKOA movement. The ideology evidenced in his social media postings, as well as his poor mental health. It was argued that the material referred to in the Facebook posts regarding the activities of UKOA and that movement's ideology comprised statements consistent with the use of violent extremism to achieve their aims. This is in turn consistent with what the defendant says in his own Facebook and YouTube posts. Notice how it's all Facebook. This is just what I want to point out. It's all Facebook. Half the people on Facebook are the police. 55. Although recent communications between the defendant and his Justice Health mental health team appeared to include disavowal of his previously expressed beliefs, recorded conversations between the defendant and UKOA members, 18 February 2021, suggests that he still maintains those beliefs. 56. I interpolate here to observe that I'm not persuaded that those phone calls form a solid base for that submission. There are statements made in those calls by the defendant that suggest to the contrary. and the calls were almost 5 months ago. Neither side of the police's statement can be in any way true, if that's the case. Definition: interpolate. 1. Insert something of a different nature into something else. 2. Interject a remark in a conversation. 57. The plaintiff submitted that concerns regarding mental health comprise the nature of the defendant's mental illness. The prior history of compliance with medication and his failure to comply with supervision by community corrections, as well as his lack of insight and impaired judgment. There is a whole entire statement made up of words directed at the mental health within that correction facility that were then backed up by that mental health in that corrections facility. You can see how these are direct usages of the words within those documents. 58. The written and oral submissions made on behalf of the plaintiff then descended into a level of complexity which it described as potential, open quote, risk scenarios, close quote. The complexity of these potential and in some ways speculative scenarios, to my mind, underscore the speculative and uncertain nature of the risk allegedly presented by the defendant that he will commit a serious terrorism offence. The complexity of these potential scenarios, to my mind, they are complex. And this is where she's pointing out to the police, do you really know who you work for? 59. The first scenario was said to comprise the defendant continuing with the conduct of the kind engaged in prior to his arrest and incarceration, and the second, the risk of escalation of his conduct. 60. It was explained that the first risk was the defendant's previous threats of hanging authority figures, including police, as threats of action that would fall within the definition of, open quote, terrorist act, close quote, in section 100.1(2) of the code, but not subsection 3. These are threats of an action that would result in death, and are threats made first with the intention of advancing a political or ideological cause, and second, with the intention of influencing the police or other public figures in the performance of their duties. It was argued that the defendant's, open quote, continued adherence, close quote, to these previously expressed beliefs indicates a real prospect of him resuming conduct of the kind engaged in prior to his arrest. So there is a significant likelihood of the defendant engaging in conduct that constitutes a terrorist act being an offence contrary to section 101.1 of the code. And all these years, people have thought it's normal to be bullied into submission by the state. 61. The plaintiff accepted that the threats of violence are stated to only occur following the regime change for which the defendant advocates. but argued that this still satisfies the definition of, open quote, terrorist act, close quote, and while the likelihood of threatened hangings might be low, and while the defendant may have had no intention to encourage immediate acts of violence, such threats are significant because they might, open quote, create a milieu which fosters the prospect that personal injury will be suffered by innocent members of the community, close quote. Definition: milieu: the people, physical and social conditions and events that provide the environment in which someone acts or lives.